Hey folks, this is Ben from InstaCluster. Welcome to the next episode of InstaBlinks. And with me today, we have Andrew Mills, who is one of our senior solution architects. Andrew, thanks for joining.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ben.
Hey, no worries. Now, before we dive into it, and I'm super excited about today's topic because it is somewhat controversial. But before we jump into it, can you give me a bit of a background about your past experience and your role at InstaCluster?
Sure. Yeah. So I've spent about the last 17 years in the development database administration world. And the last six or so of that was specifically around Apache Kafka, big data pipelines in the open source community with Cassandra and other various tools. And for about the last year and a half, I've spent here at InstaCluster by NetApp as a solution architect, essentially helping translate the very technical things that are open source with the sales side of the house, and making sure that we have good technical fitment for our products for what the customer needs.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So it sounds like I'm talking to the right person here, right? Okay. So Andrew, I know I've danced around it a little bit, but it is a controversial, I guess, topic. But let's get into it, which is, should you use Kafka as a database, right? Now, for context, for people out there who are like, well, yeah, it's a streaming platform, right? Or I use it for as a message queue. That's kind of like my view, but certainly that there's some very smart people out there. There's some vendors as well that are like, hey, you can use Kafka as a database, right? And that just kind of makes me raise my eyebrows a little bit, right? So I'm gonna throw it over to you and just what's your initial take? And then maybe we can get into a little bit of like why do we have some people even suggest that, right? So let's start from the top. Should you use Kafka as a database, and why would someone say that?
So the answer I would definitively say is no, right? That is not the best use case for Kafka. Why would somebody say that? So Kafka definitely has many database-like properties, right? But when you sit down and really think about what makes a database, Kafka doesn't check most of those boxes, and so not ACID compliant. I know other databases, like Cassandra, that isn't ACID compliant, but it checks a lot more of the boxes than a Kafka does. Kafka is much more in line with what I would consider to be a data store. And so can you use Kafka as a database? Sure. Is it the right tool for the job? Not in almost all scenarios, right? There may be one or two scenarios where it might make sense, but by and large, I would say no, as just a general advice.
Hmm. Right, because I guess if you think about like when someone says a database, right, you're expecting a certain set of features. You're expecting things like schema management, right? The ability to kind of define what data looks like, how it should kind of behave for some databases, how it's related to each other for other databases, how you search on it through indexes. Um, there's a key set of things. And then also, I guess, the ability to, kind of, I guess, arbitrarily try and query data for a specific record, right, as well. And I'm not sure how well Kafka kind of ticks any of those particular boxes. But I mean, on the flip side, Kafka is a durable data store, right? I guess you put data in, and generally, unless you do something really bad, you're not going to lose it, right? You
Yeah.
can get data out of it, right? And you can get out it in some degree of order, and that kind of thing. So I guess it does have some properties of a database. Is it
Well,
is it
let's answer your two questions, right?
okay?
Real
Yeah,
quick.
sorry,
So,
sorry.
yeah, you're good. You're good. So I didn't want to forget them, right? So schema registry, right? So
Yeah.
it's managing schema. So Kafka does have an add-on called schema registry, right? You have an ability to do that, but it's not. It's a thing that lives outside of Kafka itself, right? You can't send a record to Kafka and it enforces the schema. Instead, with schema registry, you configure the client so that it can validate the schema of the data that you're sending against an external service that is schema registry. So there you can do that, but Kafka itself doesn't do it. You are adding another tool set to Kafka to achieve like schema management in that case. And frankly, in a streaming world, schema management is awesome, right? You can version your schema and stuff like that, so that we have backwards compatibility. And it's a great tool, but it's not built into Kafka. And more importantly, in the open source community, it is not enforced at the server, right? You have to configure your clients to do it. And so if that's a big differentiator, especially for the database side of things.
Yeah.
And as far as
Is schema registry, you said it's not part of Kafka, but like, is it part of the project, or is it open source? Is it like, how easy is that for people to use?
So the only open source schema registry now is what's called Carapace schema registry, which Instacluster actually contributes to. But it is an open source project in Git. You can just Google Carapace schema registry. It's also REST proxy. And it is relatively easy to add on. And in our managed service, it's just a checkbox. But it is pretty easy to add on to your Kafka deployment.
Okay. And so I guess going back to the second part of my first question, right? Which is like, I think it sounds like generally using Kafka as a database doesn't make sense, especially when you're like, there are better, more databasey databases out there, right? Like, what does everyone say? Just use Postgres, right? When would you even entertain this idea? Are there edge cases or use cases where you'd be like, maybe we can treat it as a database?
Yeah. So there are maybe a couple, right? And so one of the other questions that you asked was, can I use Kafka? Can I query Kafka, right? And it doesn't have a query language like you would expect natively built in, right? You're going to have to just subscribe to a topic, and maybe you can store metadata outside of Kafka, and that way you can understand, like, at a certain offset in a certain partition, that's when this thing happened, and I want to start from here and stream all of the data. But it's not the type of thing that you can query, right? So you're not going to be able to get those results back. Now, there are two scenarios where you could use it as a database, but really, again, it's more of a data store. And one of those is almost like a cache, right? So there's a concept called compacted topics. And so in compacted topics, you will key your data, and that key is just like a normal primary key in a relational database. And then the data that gets put in there is then compacted by the key. So basically the last one in wins in that scenario. And so in that situation, you can use it, but again, it's more like a cache because you still can't query it, right? You can do some timestamp stuff, but you can't like say, give me the cache for this user ID. It's just not that easy, right? You have to actually pull all of the cache from it. So I've seen people actually use that as a quick way to backfill Redis, right? So if you think about Redis is the ultra fast cache, and then sometimes Redis, it can be treated ephemerally, right? Depending on how you're using it. And when it dies and I need to stand a new instance up, I quickly need to rehydrate Redis with my data so I can do key searches. Well, a compacted Kafka topic can quickly rehydrate that for you instead of a query to a NoSQL or SQL database. So that's going to be one good example where you could kind of use it like a database, but it's mostly to hydrate an actual key value store or something like that.
Right.
The only other one I've seen was, I believe it was the New York Times who did it, but essentially they used it as part of their RSS feed. Every article they'd ever posted, they posted it into a Kafka topic, and then subscribers could subscribe to that topic, and then it would syndicate the articles out. And in that case, again, it's not queryable. It is just a means to distribute information to consumers downstream. So they just tapped in and said, give me all your stuff. And if that particular syndicate didn't want a constant stream, like in an RSS feed or something like that, then they would tap in once a day. It's not queryable, but they're going from their last offset. Okay, I last read you, at offset 1, 2, 3, 4. Give me everything newer than that, right? And it would pull it. So those are really the only two that I've experienced that people have had good success with, and then really getting what they want out of it, and not having lots of performance headaches and down the stream.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess it sounds like, and really a lot of these arguments, it comes down to like your definition, right? But it sounds like there are some use cases where like Kafka can be used as a durable, long-term data store, right? But it lacks some of the traditional capabilities, right, that we would, associate with a database. And right, that cache rehydration example is really good. And I guess we're kind of starting to see an extension of that as Kafka becomes more and more critical to data pipelines, right? It's always hydrating, either some data lake somewhere, or something like ClickHouse, or something like that as well. It is very, I guess, a core part of that, and being able to rehydrate, or to just grab a snapshot in time of the particular data that you want to stream, right? Based on offset, or whatever that might be. I guess, what about as a time series database, right? Like even if we just go, okay, like, look, we can query our data based on either timestamp or an offset, and we're only just getting like chunks or areas of data. Like, I'm trying to be as generous as possible to Kafka in this case, like, and we're going to construct the perfect use case. Could we use it as a time series database, or are we still kind of falling in that data store kind of area?
I definitely think it's still the data store area. So could you? Sure, right? But some of the things that you have to consider is, what are the technical complexities involved with actually doing that, right? So it goes back to the whole, you can't query it, right? Now, you can absolutely have different keys and things like that, where you could stream the entire topic or partition, right? And you could filter it based on a key, but you're transporting a tremendous amount of data across the pipe for what, right? Now, if you need 90% of that data every time, that might be reasonable, right? Because it's going to come at you fast. But if you're only going to need 5% of that data, it's probably a better idea to choose something else. And you can talk about other ways to design it, right? So like, if you have 1,000 clients, and you're always going to want events that happened in order for every client, and instead of doing keys, I'm just going to have 1,000 topics all of a sudden, and now I'm just going to subscribe to that one topic from a certain offset and pull it all. That's an option, but now you've got 1,000 topics, which then you've got X a number of partitions per, and now you start running into other issues with having too many topics and partitions, and having to have your cluster really big. Artificially, where you have tons of CPU and RAM headroom. So it's really a conversation about, what does your data look like? How do you need access to it? And what is the most efficient thing? And to me, it's always use the right tool for the job. Don't use a tool in a different way to achieve the objective, or try to modify this tool so that it can work for your use case, because when there's other ones out there, right? Because people get used to Kafka, right? They're immersed in it, they're immersed in the ecosystem, they know the technology, and so they're creative, and that's great. We love that. But when you try to start solving things that have already been solved in that technology, you start to see issues.
Yeah. Look, I think we've got the definitive answer, which is Kafka is not a database, right? You got a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail, right? So, make sure you pick up other tools and think about what else you got in your kind of tool belt there when you're thinking about things. But at the same time, Kafka is a very critical part of, your durable data infrastructure, right? It can be used to rehydrate caches. It can be used, to kind of serve time series data at volume if you need to, right? So there you go. Data store, not a database.
I would agree. Thanks, Ben.
Awesome.